maybe you can start with the verdict and what Roman is facing and all that hangs in the balance as a result of this trial.
But there is a lot of good news here, I think, for people who are on this side of the aisle, so to speak, because there was a verdict, but also there were, in a couple of important cases, no verdicts. And that is on the charges of conspiracy to commit money laundering and conspiracy to commit sanctions violations. The jury was not able to reach a decision on those charges. So you had a hung jury and a mistrial, effectively. That means that the federal government can retry those charges if it wants to. That's an open question that we can talk about, but there's no guilty verdict. So he did escape what could have been the very worst impacts of this, because each of those charges carried a potential sentence of 20 years. The third charge, the charge that he was convicted on, which we can go into depth about kind of the weirdness of it, and frankly, the reason that he was convicted was, at least according to some analysts, really more of a technical matter than the jury thinking that he actually committed a substantive crime. But he did get a guilty charge on that. Even in court, because of some of these complexities that we'll get into, the Judge Catherine Fila, who was the sitting judge here, acknowledged that there's a clear path to appeal. Obviously, whether it's successful or not depends on a lot, but there's clear reasons to appeal this judgment on the money transmitting charge. And even Judge Fila acknowledged that from the bench. So there is a world where he serves 5 years. There's a world much more likely than that where he serves a couple of years. And there is definitely a world where this gets appealed and thrown out and he remains free, which he is now.
Well, let's do a little recap. Obviously, people are familiar with Tornado Cash, maybe in the broad strokes. They know that it's become sort of a message and sort of a meme for a movement of people who care about financial privacy. Can you take us back to the arrest of Roman Storm and the really early beginnings of this case? Obviously, he deployed a piece of code online that he authored that ran afoul of the government, and that sort of set in motion all that you just discussed.
Yeah, and I think it's important to actually even go back before the arrest and the charges, because the story really, at least the story that we got at trial, really begins in around 2019 when Roman Storm, Roman Semenov, and Alexei Pertsev, they were all three, I believe, at ETH Boston. So they were in Boston. I think this was on the Harvard campus at a hackathon. They had already received advice from people, including Vitalik Buterin, co-founder of Ethereum, that if they wanted to build something very useful on Ethereum, privacy was what was needed the most. And there was a lot of evidence presented at trial to the effect that there is this community on Ethereum who are fundamentally good actors, honest people, not North Korean hackers, who wanted this privacy technology to exist, who in these very mainstream public venues discussed the creation of this. And I think that that's somewhat reflected in the hung jury, the fact that there were all these legitimate users and legitimate fans. A lot of the people who were witnesses for both the prosecution and the defense said that they admired, in some sense or another, what the Tornado Cash people had built as both technology and as a privacy service. So the foundations of this, it's really, if you're coming at it from somebody like us who's been involved in crypto for a long time, specifically, I've been very aware of what's going on in Ethereum for a long time. From that inside view, you can see how building something like this would just feel like a very professional, public, open, normal thing to do. So going into 2020, 2021, they developed this code, they deployed it. And by 2020, they had actually, and this is kind of key to the timeline here, by 2020, they had locked the contracts and the pools that make up Tornado Cash, which we can get into the technicalities there. But you can just deploy these devices that exist without any active intervention from the people who actually created them. And that's key, because after that 2020 date, nobody could change the back end operation of Tornado Cash. Now, one of the important aspects of the trial is that Pertsev, Storm, and Semenov founded a company called PepperSec, and PepperSec did maintain certain ancillary services to Tornado Cash. So the web interface where it was very easy to use, and also sort of back-end mechanisms called routers and relayers that had various functions. They had varying degrees of control over those systems and operations. But the crime that is charged, at least in the initial indictment, there was a lot of focus on the Ronin hack, which I believe took place in 2022. So 2 years after the code for Tornado Cash was locked. And there was a total of about $600 million stolen by, we now know, DPRK hackers going by the notorious Lazarus Group. And so they stole a bunch of money, and then it started going through Tornado Cash. At this point, the principals all panicked. This was the largest tranche. There had been sort of other incidents where major hacks had been, some of them gone through Tornado Cash, and people had seen that because you can observe on chain things go right up to the edge of the Tornado Cash pools. So you kind of know what's going in. And some of the evidence at trial that was, I think, the most interesting and the most open to interpretation was, at this point, they sort of panicked. We have records of text messages thanks to Alexei Pertsev's phone getting seized in the Netherlands. And so we see them sort of panicking, essentially, as all these hacked funds start going through Tornado Cash, saying things like, "We're fucked. These idiots are destroying our statistics." These are basically quotes from the chats. But the government at trial really tried to depict this as awareness of crimes being committed using things that they controlled. These are the sort of debates that I think the jury had to weigh in on. And I think, again, the hung jury on these charges makes clear that they did not entirely buy the idea either that Tornado Cash was built for criminal purposes or that the co-founders were just sort of like perfectly happy to have criminals use them.